Good afternoon. I'm Laurie Sundberg. I'm the president of Kirkwood Community College. I would like to welcome you to the Iowa Ideas Conference. The Iowa Ideas Conference is in its fourth year, and it's an important opportunity to gather Iowans around a common experience. Really, now more than ever, we commit to providing opportunities for every Iowan to be part of this experience. 2020 is a year that none of us could have predicted. Yet in true Iowa Ideas fashion, we see this year as an opportunity to raise up the issues that will bring us a stronger tomorrow. Kirkwood is honored to support the Iowa Ideas Conference. It's a great example of partnering with others in our community to bring a terrific conference to our state and to Iowans. Enjoy the conference.
Good morning. My name's Grace King. I'm a reporter at the Gazette. I'm the education reporter at the Gazette, and today we'll be speaking with Dr. Ryan Wise, Laurie Phelan, and Justin Blietz about closing the opportunity gaps for students. Dr. Wise is the Dean of the College of Education at Drake University. Previously, he was the director of the Iowa Department of Education and emphasized working together as an education system to make Iowa schools into places where adults can collaborate and students can thrive. Laurie is the director of iJAG, which helps kids build the skills they need to be successful in the classroom and build workplace skills by bringing employers into the classroom to provide mentoring. And Justin is the Director of Culture and Climate Transformation for the Cedar Rapids Community School District and is working to support the social, emotional, and behavioral and health needs of students and equity and anti-racism efforts in the district. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Let's start with talking about what opportunity gaps exist for students who come from historically marginalized communities. Justin, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think looking in our current context with the derecho and with COVID, it's really accentuated and highlighted a lot of gaps that were already there and bringing those to the forefront. And so we like to talk a lot about the achievement gap and how students aren't achieving at the same rates as their peers, but often that is a result of inequities and opportunities and resources. And so one thing that we've really tried to highlight as a district is ensuring equity and access to resources in this current pandemic, whether that's through the technology tools, hotspots, things of that nature. We've also made sure as a district that is not necessarily reflected in demographics of its community. We're primarily white district, and that's not necessarily true for Cedar Rapids. We've made a significant effort to try to uplift the voices in the community, giving people a platform and then responding to that feedback. So for example, we've engaged in the Not Without Me forums where we were getting feedback from the community. We had some anti-racism town halls this summer, and some feedback we got from that was we weren't engaging our families in a way that was most helpful to them and at a rate that they wanted to be engaged. And so we've made a significant effort to respond to that feedback this year by, as an entire system district, engaging in a family engagement initiative where every single student in our system is contacted by their teacher once a month, and those calls are really specific and targeted in how we're teaching families how to use the platforms that they'll need to support their children online, or letting them know where their students are achieving in relation to their peers. And so that a really specific focus with that. So I think responding to the community has been very important.
I guess I'd throw in on that, if I could, Grace, a little bit, that sometimes the opportunity gap exists through unintended consequences. So sometimes the way that a structure of an education system is set up doesn't really allow students to be engaged, especially the population of students that we serve in iJAG, some of the marginalized populations that you mentioned earlier. So sometimes it doesn't really allow them to be engaged because maybe they're behind academically, maybe they don't have the resources to fully engage with other activities within the school, and so they don't have the same access points as other students. So one of the things that we really try to do in partnership with the schools that we're in through iJAG is to make sure that that relationship piece, that connecting piece that often is about resiliency for our kids happens both with in the school and individuals within the school, but also with community members outside of the school, such as private industry. So sometimes those opportunity gaps form not intentionally, but through some of the consequences that just happen naturally as we have systems that try to have hundreds of thousands of young people going through them. So the supports that we can provide through nonprofit collaborations and community collaborations with bringing the community into our schools is often a critical and very successful way in closing some of that gap.
Go ahead, Dr. White.
Just to add to that, I really appreciate, Grace, you coming right out of the chute saying opportunity gaps and broadening it beyond achievement. And I think achievement is important, right? But it is a single point in time measure often. Percent proficient on a test of English skills or mathematics skills. And we certainly do have achievement gaps in Iowa. I look to my oldest son, his middle school, which is an incredibly diverse middle school. More than 80% of the white students in that school were proficient or above on math, on the Iowa assessments. For African American students in that same school, 34% proficient. That is a huge achievement gap. But then we need to immediately broaden it out to look at access and all of those things, both in and beyond the school, that fuel that. And so to give one example of an opportunity gap, I look at my youngest son's public elementary school that he was in, and my oldest son as well. And about 5 years ago, they created a student council, which was a great opportunity for elementary students. Yet to participate in the student council, the student had to be there by 7:30 a.m. That was earlier than the buses arrive. So you take out all of the students who have transportation access issues are automatically unable to participate in student council. In addition, if a student had any disciplinary infractions, they were ineligible to participate in student council. And we know that there are disproportionate discipline issues by race across all schools across the United States. And so I think, Laurie mentioned unintended consequences of well-intentioned ideas. We come up with ideas like this, yet how are we thinking about ensuring all students can participate and take advantage of those opportunities?
Go ahead, Laurie. Did you have something
no,
to add to that, Laurie? Sorry. Yeah, there you go. So that kind of leads into my next question is, how can schools be better supported to serve students with different economic backgrounds or educational needs, maybe social emotional needs? And also, could these conversations take place maybe in the legislature?
Just to kind of piggyback on what I heard Ryan say, and I think is a great point when he talked about disproportionality. I think we like to admire the problems a lot and observe problems outside of ourselves, but we don't often look within. One thing that we've spent a lot of time within our district, and I think is really important, is working to grow our intercultural mindset. So we use the intercultural development inventory, and it's a tool for us to reflect on not only ourselves and how we navigate difference, but how others perceive us. And so that's one thing when I think of the disproportionality with discipline referrals. That doesn't necessarily mean that students of color are engaging in those behaviors more frequently. It just means that if we haven't confronted our own biases and thought through the lens in which we're viewing the world, we know all the way down to preschool that African American females are suspended at a much higher rate, and a lot of that has to do with they've done studies tracking eye movement, and we're more focused in looking at those students, and we perceive African American females as older than they actually are, and all of these biases, if we don't spend time confronting those and really reflecting on those and understanding, not shaming ourselves or blaming ourselves, but understanding that we've been socialized through media, through our experiences, to have this lens through which we view the world. We have to be cognizant of that and recognize the role that plays and how we support our students and families. And if we don't do that, if we don't do the self work, it's really hard to do the systems work.
Yeah,
It's
that's such
really a
good point.
great point, Justin. I think the self-reflection, where are the gaps, as you know, from our perspective, and even when we try as a system to do it all by ourselves, and that's a challenge too. Many people look at our public schools and say, "Hey, why aren't they?" When they've got a variety of things that they're trying to do, and that's where some of the solutions, some of the opportunities we have is to look around us and see who are those other resources that are near me. My community colleges, my higher education institutions, my agencies, the United Way, organizations like iJAG, nonprofits that can help, that lend a hand in this work. And for, you mentioned the legislature, and I know at least the three of us have a lot of experience with the legislature. But one of the things that I found successful from our perspective is that, you know, the lens of our legislators happens to be from the community that they come from. So they might not understand the full view of the communities and the struggles of young people across the state. So bringing some relevancy to them is a really good thing. Just like we say, it's relevance is important to our students. That's why hands-on stuff really matters. So when young people, especially young people from our public school system, are able to engage with our legislature in real time and tell their story, I know that takes time, but it's building relationship and sharing the story of the world that they come from, the challenges that they come from. Because I have not met a legislator yet that completely can close off their heart to hearing a young person's plight and challenges in the school systems or in their community. And I think that relevancy for our legislature as well as relevancy for our young people is really critical.
I would completely agree with both Justin and Laurie. And I would add to that, I think data can be a powerful tool in that self-reflection that Justin talked about, and that supporting legislators as they look at the challenges that exist across the state. I think a great source of that data is that Iowa School Performance Profiles, which looks at a number of data points. It gets beyond just the achievement indicators. And for example, it has a conditions for learning survey that looks at climate and culture from the student perspective. And so for example, one of the things that's measured is student to adult relationships. And so again, you can get in there and you can look at your school. And I'll go back to my own son again when he was in middle school. If you look at student to adult relationship, there is over a 15-point gap in how white students view that relationship in a much more positive way than Black students in that same exact school. And so things like that can be a real tool, as Justin was talking about, of looking at, you know, what are the things we are doing or not doing that create a different level of a welcoming, supportive environment for all of our students in the building. And I think the same is true at higher education as well. We need to be doing those things. How do we create communities of learners and those supports, and using data to identify problems in the system?
Yeah,
Ryan,
I
I'd
love
love to.
that.
Go ahead, Laurie.
No, go ahead, Justin.
I was going to say, yeah, just to piggyback on that, I love that idea because I think it's really important, the data pieces that we're using and how we're using those. I think far too often we've like fixated when we talk about discipline, for example, we got to lower suspensions, we have to lower ODRs. And what does that mean? We're telling people just don't suspend kids or just don't write referrals, which creates a really unsafe culture, right? Because then we're not addressing the problem, we're just hiding it. And so I think surveys like the conditions for learning or perception surveys really allow us to see what the students are experiencing, how they're perceiving their experience in school. And also recognizing when we talk about that intercultural development, knowing that the majority of our population is in minimization, which says we focus on commonalities just because that's part of our Western culture, rather than, you know, really understanding and identifying differences. We often minimize those experiences of our students of color or our LGBTQ students or students from different cultures and say, well, that's not my experience, so they can't be experiencing that. I'm sure they're just exaggerating, or I'm sure, you know, that's we would never do that intentionally, but really having that data and being open and honest in how we're interpreting that data and then using that to make changes, I think is really important. So I think that's been a great piece with the conditions for learning.
I agree with you, Justin, and also Ryan. I think we collect a lot of data throughout all of our systems. And it's getting then to that analytic side of the data. So when we're comparing the students that are not achieving in a deeper way to what is it that is causing them the very verses that they're not achieving as well as the others? What is the experience of those students that are not having successes that are working? So there are a variety of efforts that have been made in working with young people, especially our students that are from high poverty or diversity or rural, that we know have an impact. And yet, because of a price point on a particular effort, or because of some challenges that get in the way related to transportation or the bell schedule, we'll not continue to do them, even though we know the evidence, the data is supporting that this application of learning outside of the building might be a better approach. So looking at the data, not just collecting data, but looking at it to analyze what are we seeing really benefits the students that are in that gap, and then having the will to direct resources, both from our building, from our state, and from our community, to helping those do more of that kind of thing. It's often we're throwing data out about what's not working, and we really could focus more on what is working and emphasize those pieces and put some resources behind them.
I agree. And sometimes it's just about going a little bit deeper in the data too. I just read a fascinating book about implicit bias in schools. And they gave an example in there of a school that was struggling with participation in extracurricular activities among students of color. There were virtually no students of color participating. And so the principal wanted to find out what's going on here. And so she surveyed both the students and the teachers and asked, what do you think is driving this gap in participation? And the teachers said, well, we think it's because the students don't care about it, maybe their parents don't care, or they have a sibling to take care of. And they asked the students, and the students said something completely different. The students said, I'm not participating because I'm worried I'll be the only student of color there. I'm worried I won't make any friends. And I'm worried the teachers don't care if I participate or not. And so when we make assumptions without checking that what underlies those, I think that can perpetuate patterns that, again, create those opportunity gaps that reinforce achievement gaps. And so some of these things, like digging deeper into the data and doing it at a school level, which I know Justin is doing a ton of, it takes time, but not necessarily always a huge infusion of resources.
Justin, I think this might be a great opportunity for you to talk about the Cedar Rapids Superintendent's Advisory Council and the Black student unions maybe that are forming at the high school, and how you're trying to let students give their input into these problems.
Well, I think Ryan just hit the nail on the head when he said, this equity work doesn't require a ton of resources or a new curriculum or anything like that. We know, people know what works. We need to have equity and voice, and we need to uplift the voices that have been marginalized and haven't had a platform to share their experiences, and we need to respond. And so through our Not Without Me forums and through our anti-racism town halls that we held this summer, we recognized that we needed to provide more opportunities to hear different perspectives and hear different voices, give them a role in the decision-making process, knowing that, like I said, we have a pretty homogenous makeup when we look at our staff in Cedar Rapids. And, we're doing work to address that. We have a great new diversity recruiter in LaToya Harrington who's doing a lot of work related to that. But that work takes time, and we know that it's important to uplift those voices. And so, yes, to get more targeted, we had students present at one of our board meetings, sharing their perspectives and work that they felt needed to be done related to anti-racism and equity in our district, and had some demands. And we were able to get together with those students and set some goals together. And one of those goals is they wanted a Black student union in each of our 4 high schools. And so we've worked collaboratively with them and are on our way in engaging in that work. And have mentors and students involved currently at each of our 4 high schools, starting that process. And then our superintendent, who has been really inspiring and has a great commitment to equity and anti-racism work, has also created a superintendent's team of students who she's going to invite in an effort to get more student voice and perspectives and involve them in the decision-making process.
I like the idea about the, oh, go ahead, Grace.
Go ahead, Laurie.
Well, I was just going to piggyback on what Justin said. It's so easy because we think that we need lots of money. I don't want to say that with any of the Iowa legislature listening in, but it's not like you need lots of money. We need a lot of will in order to move those things forward, to make time on board agendas, to ask our faculty to really build relationship and take time. I used to say, and Ryan heard it nauseam probably, that we wouldn't have to teach any content for the first half of the year, and we would be able to teach all the content in the second half if in the first half of the year we only focused on relationship development. If we really helped our young people know that we cared about them, that we were listening to them, that we were engaged with them on their hopes and dreams, they would be willing and wanting to engage more in the broader learning and go deeper into some of our content areas. And that doesn't take a lot of money, but it certainly takes a different approach than what we're having right now with our, and have had forever in our education systems. But if you ask the students, and when we do, like Justin was just saying, they'll tell you from their heart, they do not feel like they're having a relationship with the folks in their building. And maybe not even in their community, and they might not even feel like they're being seen. So taking less money, but more time, at doing that work of really engaging our young people with the adults in their building and their community, and who may be their future employers, is really worth the time and is a different approach than what we're taking right now in our general processes for education.
Laurie, just to piggyback on that, I'm sorry, Grace, I don't know if I'm supposed to be waiting for you, but it just, what you said reminded me of a story when we talk about the importance of relationship building and hopes and dreams. So I mentioned earlier this family engagement work that we're engaging in as an entire district. And to start the year, we asked every teacher to make a call to every student, every single family and every student in our district. And the purpose of that first call was simply to, build relationships and to identify the hopes and dreams that parents had for their students, because we know that every family has hopes and dreams and wants the best for their child, right? And we had I won't share which school, but one of our elementary teachers was a 27-year veteran and was a little apprehensive about this. It's not work that he had engaged in previously. And so he had talked to his administrator and said, oh, gosh, I'm not sure, I'm a little anxious. Engaged in the work and went through and talked with each family, welcoming them. I'm so excited to have your child in school this year. What are your hopes and dreams, and how can we work together to do this? And he, after the process, he said, my gosh, I wish I could go back in time and do that again. He said, in 1 week, I know my students better than I've ever known at the end of any school year. And it just took, that first round of calls to get over that hump and engage and invite families in to be collaborative partners and to say, not there's a problem, but I'm just so thrilled to have your son or daughter, and I want to work with you this year, and I want to know what your hopes and dreams are so we can work together to do that. And, just that impact is so phenomenal. And again, it doesn't take money. It just takes time and a recognition that, that equity and voice is so powerful.
Bravo.
We have a community or an audience comment here. I feel that this was a missed opportunity to schedule only white educators as presenters for this session. And I do want to recognize that we are all white. We come from similar backgrounds, and I agree it maybe was a missed opportunity, and we'll have to do better in the future in being inclusive. Anyway, so moving forward, just a few comments back, you said something about how new curriculum isn't necessarily needed to be inclusive, but I know students in both Cedar Rapids and the Iowa City school districts, students of color, are asking for history curriculums and language arts curriculums to be looked at and to be more inclusive. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, are you asking me to, is that to me, Grace, or? I don't want to
anyone who'd like to
yeah,
take
no,
it away.
I just don't want to monopolize the conversation. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to necessarily change our curriculum. I think our standards are our standards, and the standards are important. We need to teach the standards, but the way we address those standards can definitely be addressed. And so when we look at what are the required texts, what are the different ways that we're teaching the curriculum, I think that is a great opportunity for increasing representation, including student voice, including community voice, in what we're choosing. If we're just relying on a small group of people to make those curriculum decisions related to, well, we've always done Shakespeare, so let's keep doing Shakespeare, we're going to keep getting, some of the inequitable results that we historically have. And so I don't know that we need to go out and purchase a new curriculum, but I do, again, think it's an opportunity to bring in different perspectives, different voices, and look at, what kind of representation do we have in our curriculum, and doing some equity audits related to that, and seeing how we can be better and more inclusive and more representative in the work that we use.
I would completely agree. And we're actually doing that at the School of Education at Drake in supporting our students who are going to become teachers. So a couple examples of it, we're actually doing an audit of the materials in our curriculum library. So we have lots of children's literature that students here can access to work in their practicums and student teaching experiences. And so we have a graduate class that is pulling all of our early childhood lit. And essentially, as Justin said, doing an equity audit to ensure we have a representation of diverse authors and diverse characters, because we know representation matters, and for students to be able to see themselves in what they read and in what they study. And then we're also doing it at the program level with our professors, looking at the courses they're teaching, and are they, again, using a diverse representation of authors and scholars that they're bringing into their courses. One specific example of that, so we redid our Intro to Education course this year. And we have framed about half of the course now all around issues of systemic racism, equity, social justice, redid the text that we're using, and ensuring that we have a continuum of focusing on these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the time of a student's life here at Drake. And so I think those issues are important in K-12, and I think they're also critically important in teacher and leader preparation as well.
I agree with you, Ryan, and we've been involved with some of the folks that are in your administrator and teacher prep, so that's fun. But I'm coming from probably the Audits lens. I'm not an educator and I'm not in education, but I would say, as we're looking at changing the tools that we're using in our classrooms, we've got a whole world out there, and students mostly have it right here on their phone. So if we're a little bit broader in our thinking, allowing student voice into what should be those competencies, or where should those pieces of information be coming from to help us learn. If a competency-based approach really isn't about the final what, it's about how and the process and what we want to end up with in terms of our capabilities and skills. In the past, we get so specific that we're telling people who to read and what specific parts to read versus what do we want to get out of our learning. And when we bring student voice to the table in that and the wider community, I think we get that opportunity to really prepare students for a world that's ever changing. We want to be have some empirical pieces in our schools, but also creativity in the way that we learn those pieces of information. I just think that as we look at the bigger picture of competencies versus the minute pieces of the direct instruction or the books we're using, we'll get to a better place in including student voice.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of educators talk about teaching through our current context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the racial movements that are taking place right now, how could that maybe create better opportunities, help lessen that achievement gap for students, and specifically students of color?
I'm going to just jump in because I think that student voice that you heard Justin talk about earlier really does matter. And with whether it's students of color or LGBT students or it's students with disabilities, when they're able to engage in the learning process and have a voice and feel heard, I think we have a great opportunity to close the gap. Because again, it goes back to that relationship piece. They're feeling like they're part of the solution. They're feeling like they're part of the learning equation, is having something being done to them. And so voice, I think, really matters, and providing the diversity of opportunities for our students. So whether it's a poetry slam, or if it's a meeting with the board where the students are presenting some of the things that they've been working on or challenges that they think that exist, or it's being part of a protest or a march in their community. All of those things, if we as educators can begin to embrace them as part of a learning process to gain competency in moving forward, I think we'll see that a gap close really quickly.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think it also speaks to how do we perceive the purpose of education? When we send students to school, what do we perceive as the purpose? Because I think at times, there's been a perception that it's to go learn the academic standards or the academic content. And I think when we look at what we know about development and needs, if we want students to learn, if that's the primary purpose, we can't just teach the content. We have to be able to support the physiological needs of students. We have to be able to support the social, emotional health and well-being of students. We have to provide all of those supports if we believe that our job is for students to learn and for not just us to teach, because I think there's a big difference there. We can go in and we can force feed students curriculum all day when they're not ready to access that learning. And we're not going to have great success. But if we get students to a space where Laurie said that they feel safe, they feel a sense of belonging, they have meaning and purpose in that space, it's going to be a lot easier to teach those standards. But we have to make sure that we're viewing our role as education as greater than just academic content delivery.
I agree. And I think that linking of the student sense of belonging and student voice with the importance of relevancy to what's happening in students' lives and what's happening in the world around us. And I'm a little biased because I was a history teacher for many years at the start of my career. And so there has just been such great production of new materials that link the current movements to the historical underpinnings of systemic racism and the protest movements and the freedom movements over time. And I'm excited to be teaching at the college level now too, to be able to link some of those things together for our folks that are going to become teachers. But I think tying all of those things of student voice and meeting the holistic student needs with connecting to the relevancy of the moment with high quality content, which does matter, right? But I think bringing in those other pieces are critically important too.
We have a comment here from Melissa. She said there are significant achievement gaps for students who experience disabilities. Gaps are compounded when students experience additional challenges such as socioeconomic status, race, gender. Maybe we can talk about what access to healthcare, employment, mental health resources, and other systems outside of school impact a student's opportunity gap.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because as we're trying in our public schools to do the best that we can on content, we don't get the opportunity to maybe be as aware of all of the things that might be right outside our door that could help us. That's one aspect we're not aware. But the second one is, when is their time? So I'll just tell a little story. In iJAG, we're in many of the schools across the state of Iowa, and we were having students that were having mental health challenges and needed to see a counselor. Well, we gave up space. The school gave us a little classroom, and we said that they could come and meet here, but there was no time during the day for that actually to happen, because if this student missed one more class, they would lose a credit and they wouldn't be on track to graduate. And so again, back to unintended consequences, we have to look at those things that if the priority is for this student to get some extra supports from outside the school, there have to be some flexibilities in the structure that would allow that to happen, knowing, kind of to both Justin and Ryan's point earlier, if that relevance piece, if that relationship piece matters, we have to be more nimble in our education system of learning that will allow that problem or that issue to be addressed so that they can learn. We know that if a child comes to school hungry, their ability to learn is dramatically reduced. 50%, as high as 50%. We know that if a student comes to our schools and they've had trauma in their homes, their ability to learn and readiness to learn is dramatically reduced. In the same case, then, if our teachers don't know, even if they knew of the resources that were out there, if they're not allowed to help a student get connected to them because everybody feels the pressure of getting through that particular course or content, then we've got challenges. And to me, that's an opportunity. We can look at ourselves and our structure and see how can we be more nimble in our schools so that we reduce the walls of our building of our schools and drop them to have community being able to come in and be part of our solution.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate the question. You know, earlier I made reference to, as an example, my son's former middle school, the gaps that existed between Black students and white students in terms of achievement on math proficiency. For students with disabilities in that same school, 13% were proficient in math. So we see huge gaps there as well. And so that's why that, again, access and opportunity to high quality learning experiences is so critical. And I also appreciate in the question bringing in sectors outside of education, and Laurie referenced this. I mean, we know food insecurity is a huge issue, access to high quality health care, the disproportionate impact of our justice system oftentimes can create ripples in our schools. And so all of those things combine together. And so taking a systems approach to this, not just the education system, but multiple systems in those intersections, is really, really important, because we know all of these things impact our students and our students' families.
I think a big barrier or issue related to equity when we think about students with disabilities or students coming from poverty or other areas is we often unintentionally lower our expectations for those students. And so when we talk about confronting our own biases and how we navigate our roles, I think sometimes we think, oh my gosh, this student has this disability, I'm gonna lower this expectation. Or student with an IEP for reading, well, I'm gonna give them lower than grade level text. So rather than give them the supports they need to meet the standard and maintaining those high expectations, we lower the standards, thinking we're doing those students a favor. And I think that's when we get increased gaps and have inequitable outcomes. And so rather than lowering the bar, really looking at what additional supports do we need. And so I think when we look at the current context of where we are right now with the pandemic, we know that suicide ideation has doubled. We know that students meeting the criteria for anxiety and depression has almost tripled. And so being conscious of that, we K through 8 now, we start every single day for the first half hour of the day focused on social emotional learning and giving students tools to process how they're feeling and how to navigate those emotions in an adaptive way. And then we also, for the first time this year, have a therapist in every single one of our buildings, so we can ensure that students have access to the mental health supports that they need, knowing that, you know, that's always a challenge, but even more in our current context. And so I think, again, it's so important to emphasize, we never want to lower our standards or expectations for students. We want to increase the levels of support that we're providing so students can hit that mark.
So how could the coronavirus pandemic be widening opportunity or achievement gaps? And let's talk about some solutions that we can implement right now in the middle of this crisis to help lessen those.
Well, I'd like to take it from a perspective of not necessarily widening the gap, but an opportunity to reduce the gap. So for example, as our community members around us take advantage of opportunities of this virtual relationship, when they can pivot and be able to find ways that they can engage our students in potential of a future workforce or a career, helping them understand a future career even better. So I want to give a quick example. We have a company in Iowa that for the longest time we're taking students that are in our program, so students with that come from many challenges in their background and many opportunities being presented to them differently than their peers. So this particular company, who usually had summer internships for students, especially our students, we thought they were going to cancel it, 30 of them. But what they did was create virtual opportunities for those same types of internships. So they said that those students will be able to navigate some of this opportunity even better. Well, many of our students have high poverty, so they said, well, a great idea, but we don't have any access. So the company said, what is our solution? How do we figure this out? And we wrote for grants, and we got everybody connected in high-speed internet and with technology for that period of time. So it's the willingness of being able to think differently and outside of our box, but also being willing to invest some of those resources that allow those students to participate, not just say, well, I guess we won't be able to do that because of the pandemic or because of whatever the reason might be at that particular time.
Yeah, I appreciate Laurie's positive take on this, because I think there is an upside here, right? That could come from the current situation. I also do think at the same time we need to acknowledge that the pandemic has disproportionately negatively impacted low-income communities and communities of color, and that creates real challenges for our schools and for our students and families. And so to the earlier question about the legislature, I think this is going to raise questions about how do we ensure we're properly resourcing schools and supporting educators. I think you look at Des Moines, which I believe at the current point has lost over 1,000 students, many of whom have pre-kindergartners whose parents have chosen not to put them in yet, or students who have gone to other private school options. And so how do we think about ensuring that our schools remain healthy and vibrant, even in the face of a crisis? Some of the solutions and things we can do along the lines of what Laurie was saying, here at the School of Education, we have worked with a couple of different organizations to mobilize our students who are in the teacher education program to become tutors, to work with, for example, Children and Families of Iowa, who are supporting students in Des Moines public schools who don't have good home access to internet and high quality learning experiences. So how can we get some of our students working with those students to support them and meet their learning needs? We've also worked with the Greater Des Moines Partnership to create the DSM tutor connection to allow parents to connect directly with Drake School of Ed students and students in other colleges around Iowa to support their needs. So I do think, to Laurie's point, there are real opportunities that could come from this to work more closely together, access more resources, and at the same time, we do need to acknowledge the negative impact and mobilize as a state to address that.
Yeah, and moving school online, even partially online, I guess, how do you look out for the academic gaps and kind of bridge those? I appreciate your talking about your students who are working to tutor other students. That's an incredible start.
One of them would be making sure that we're not creating another problem. Do you know what I mean? By going virtually, sometimes we want to make sure that we have a solution for every one of those students that might not have access or the time based on the numbers of members of their family that are trying to get online. So for a specific example, many of our schools are engaging students in complete online learning where they're not engaging with the teacher face-to-face. Well, based on the conversation that we just had, we know for the students that often are marginalized, that's a gap in relationship, and a huge one, and doesn't help with the mental health challenges that young people are having, or the connection, or the relevancy, and all of those things. So sometimes when we create these types of opportunities that fill gaps in especially a virtual environment, we need to go back and look at, are we having some unintended consequences? So I'd encourage that any of our schools that have online learning solo, let's look at the demographics of the students participating, and are there some resources and supports that we need to be building into that so that they're not falling behind just academically, but in their connections to their community, in their mental health and supports that are needed for them to make sure that they feel safe and valued and supported.
I think relationships are more important than ever right now in a remote context. We have to have strong relationships with families and with students because everybody's needs are so unique as they're learning how to navigate, whether it's the Google platforms or Zoom meetings or turning on a hotspot or simply turning on a laptop that I've never had to use before. There's just so many unique needs and circumstances and all across the board. And so I think if we don't have incredibly strong relationships with families where families trust us to reach out, and I think as schools, we need to be responsible for taking that first step and second step and maybe even third step to ensure that we have a strong relationship and we're understanding families' needs and students' needs. I don't think we can educate in a remote environment if we're not having that consistent communication with families and students in an individualized context.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe when you bring students back into the classroom, how do you kind of work on addressing all the opportunities they may have missed during the coronavirus and making sure that those who maybe do have opportunity gaps have just as much opportunity moving forward?
I heard somebody say the other day that the pandemic and the derecho hasn't as much created gaps as it's exposed significant flaws in our systems. The flaws that were always there but were able to be hidden are now very much exposed. And I think when we look at our ideal state of having a competency-based system where students are getting instruction based on their needs, not just blanket instruction that goes out to everybody in the same format in the same way on the same day, I think that's a way that we've taught and we've been able to get away with for a long time. And now knowing that these gaps are furthering and students are getting different things, we're going to have to really be cognizant of creating individualized opportunities and knowing where students are performing and what they need. And so I think that's going to be really essential.
I think going back to earlier conversations that we were all having about giving the students voice, making sure that we're listening and getting a sense of where they're coming from, being able to fully engage all of the students, because we know we have some of those that are silent, sitting in the back and aren't as vocal as at least I would have been in school. So being able to engage those young folks to be able to get their voice out there, that means that we're providing a variety of avenues for them to express themselves. It's not just, raising your hand and giving an answer, but it's journaling, or it's connecting to another nonprofit organization or an entity like the counselors that you're having in your schools, Justin, as an outlet for their voice. And then having our internal organization, the school, come together and be able to say, here's what we're hearing from our students.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left of the panel. Do you have any final thoughts or questions that you'd like to discuss? And participants, if you have any questions you'd like to ask the panel, please pop them into the chat.
I think I'd like to just say, Grace, thank you for this opportunity for us to have this conversation. I think many people who are probably on, I see some of their names, have as much to lend to this conversation as at least I do. But I think one of the cool things is that we're having this dialogue, and we're, for the most part, seeing that exposure that Justin mentioned, that this opportunity for us to have our eyes wide open for a bit. I hope we don't close them. I hope that we're really going to our legislators, that we're speaking to the governor, that we're talking in our communities to elected officials, that we're encouraging our students to do the same and allowing them the time and space to do that. All of those things are going to help us really close that gap, not just the achievement in the academic world, but overall, because at the end of the day, in our K through 12 system, those students are going to leave. And then they're going to, you know, the populations that we're talking about live and raise a family within about 50 miles of where they went to high school. That means they're going to be running our communities or not in the future. And so if we're not really helping provide them an opportunity to have voice, to engage, then we're probably not doing our best work. And this is a great time for us to have eyes wide open.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we have one last question here. Many states put additional dollars into their basic school funding formula for low-income students. Iowa does not. While some supplementary things can be done for cheap, a lot can take more dollars. What can we do with $700 a kid, which is 10% additional dollars, and supplementary funding weighing for kids in free and reduced lunch?
Mm-hmm.
I think
I
that's
Dr. Wise, would you like to?
Yeah, that has real merit. I mean, and I think even more so now, and deserves another round of consideration given the pandemic. I think schools are going to need real support, particularly those in urban areas, those that serve diverse populations, those that struggled to find the space and the ability to deliver in-person instruction. That is a gap that occurred because of this. You look in, you know, Des Moines, that is something we are, you know, as a community dealing with. And so hopefully the current situation will add a sense of urgency to that, that topic. And I think in terms of how that money would be used, I mean, I think there's a lot of different avenues, but that's certainly worthy of conversation and debate for sure.
All right. Well, Dr. Wise, Justin, I want to give you time for any final comments. Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, I just reiterate what Laurie said. I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this dialogue, and I'm thankful that we're having these important conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are a lot of good resources and opportunities like this to get out and learn. And so I appreciate everyone that was able to join today. One of the, so Dr. Ron Ferguson, I think, was going to be on this panel. And I saw that he is now the keynote at 1:15. And so I think he was, I'm a little biased again because he was a former professor of mine and has researched a number of areas from, you know, student voice and engagement to school reform to brain development. And so those of you who are on this conversation today, I think he will take what we started with and deepen it further. And so he will present a great learning opportunity as well.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you mentioning that. That's a good reminder to our audience here. And thank you, panelists, for taking the time to talk to us about closing these opportunity gaps for students. And thank you for all your insightful questions. If you'd like to further the conversation or have questions for our panelists, you can direct message speakers through the Whova app. And you can also hop over to networking rooms and connect with other attendees. So thank you so much for your time this morning. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.